Howdy, folks. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, have a new TTRPG video because I'm going to be taking some time here, folks, and talking about some Robotech stuff because I think it's a good time to do a retro review of Robotech. Now, this is going to be the Palladium version of Robotech, and it's going to be the first edition is what I'm going to be reviewing. So everything here that I am discussing today only has to pertain to Palladium's first edition of Robotech. I will actually be discussing the travesty that is second edition Robotech from Palladium in a future video. But let's get into it on how it pretty much all begins. And with just like most TTRPGs, it's going to start with character creation. Once again, you're going to be picking your race. You can actually play as Zentradi, you can play as human, you can play as micronized Zentradi. And then, of course, while you're going through that process of picking your race, you're also going to be rolling your attribute scores, which I have here in front of you now. You can read over it quick. I'll just let you pause the video instead of wasting time discussing it. Now, with that being said, like I said, there is information there on playing Zentradi, as well as there's OCCs for playing Zentradi, as well as the next step essentially would be picking your OCC, which could be Veritech Pilot, could be Destroyed Pilot, and pretty much that's your character class. It's actually your occupation in the game, if you will. And when you pick your occupation, there's actually going to be a pay scale with it, which I think is really cool. Kind of gives that more militaristic feel to the game, if you will, by having a pay scale. There's also going to be certain skills that you're going to be starting with and skills that you can pick from to start out. And that's essentially the next step in the character creation process is picking your skills and using, of course, throughout the game, you're going to use skills. Using skills in this game is really simple. It's all based on a percentile system. So you're going to roll essentially a D100 and a D10, or you're going to roll two D10. Obviously, you're going to need them to be different colors or something, so that way you can signify which one is the 00 die and which one is your 10s die. Which one's your 1s die and which one's your 10s die. Sorry, I had to correct myself there really quick. And essentially, you're just trying to roll below your skill percentage. As your character increases in level, your skill is going to also increase in percentage. So basically, it gets easier for you to be successful at that skill. Really, really simple when it comes to using skills in this game. Now, with that being said, though, the skills are quite chunky. There's a lot of skills to pick from. And one issue, too, is because certain skills changes your stats, like your attributes, and changes like your hit points and things of that nature. There is kind of a little bit of a meta because Robotech is more drawn towards being a combat-based game than a narrative-based game, although there's room for narrative there. Of course, now with all that being said and covered, you will need a full set of D&D dice to play this game. You're going to need the percentiles. Percentiles is what you're going to be using for skills. I just covered. The D20 is primarily used for combat, basically used for hitting, dodging, things of that nature. And then your other dice is primarily used for damage rolls. Now, one cool thing about this system versus the Strange Machine Games version is that it actually does have a martial arts system. You can do basic, you can do expert, and then you can do martial arts. There's only 3 types of martial arts in this. However, with that being said, if you have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and other strangeness, you can have 2 additional martial arts because Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Other Strangeness adds ninjutsu and adds assassin as 2 different types of martial arts that you can have. Understand, folks, that a lot of the Palladium games, RPGs, are compatible with one another. Believe it or not, Palladium, for how much shit people gives Palladium, was actually doing the GURPS thing before GURPS was a thing. Now, to be honest, GURPS does it better, but Palladium was on the ground floor of trying to come up with a generic, universal role-playing game system. Now, the next thing to point out with the Palladium version of Robotech is there is some of the expanded universe stuff, basically stuff that you really don't see or only see like a glimpse of, such as this tank here. You actually see it, but you only ever see it once in the Robotech Macross Saga show. You only get to see it once. In this game, you can actually play with this tank. There's also some stuff that they took in some artistic license for to kind of fill in gaps that the show didn't really have. Now, with that being said, it's all pretty logical. They're not doing anything crazy or off the wall. It's like, basically it's like, cars to maybe fit certain spots, or a combat knife or whatever else to basically fit gaps that really should already be filled, but they're just not, because they just really were not in the Robotech cartoon, at least when it comes to equipment and body armor. Now, one thing that stood out to me with this RPG, with the Palladium version of Robotech many moons ago when I opened it up, was this actually has a long-term trauma system, and it also has insanity as a rule. Your characters can be put into comas. They may need mental treatment due to stress of combat, things of that nature. I found it actually really interesting. I was really surprised by it. And honestly, this was the first game that I actually had ran into that from. Understand, like, insanity would show up in other future tabletop role-playing games I'd get involved in, such as Call of Cthulhu. But once again, I think Palladium was actually kind of on the ground floor of coming up with some type of long-term trauma system as well as an insanity system. So I'm actually quite impressed by that. The mecha combat is, let's get into the experience points here. And essentially the experience points is very ad hoc. It's just kind of something you're just going to have to figure it out, do it on the fly. But honestly, the experience points is not bad. Now, the experience point awards table is actually longer than what you see here. And there's some that I really don't do, like perform skill. I really don't award experience points for just generally performing skills. However, performing a difficult skill that kind of shifts the way things are going in a fight or whatever, then I will award those experience points. Or if there's a cunning use of that skill, etc. So you got to kind of take their experience points table with a pinch of salt, if you will, but it works if you basically understand how the game goes. Understand that Robotech for me was actually not my first Palladium TTRPG. It was actually Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Other Strangeness. So when I got to doing Robotech, I already had a bit of experience at dealing with a Palladium-based system. Now, the next thing I want to get into here is now I want to actually get into mecha combat. And in general terms, what I have to say is it's very crunchy, and honestly, I don't like it. I couldn't find my house rules, but essentially, I remember having a series of house rules to completely throw out their mecha combat rules and use my own mecha combat rules in combination with some of the stuff they have. Because they have things like hit locations. There's different types of damages, which there's SDC and then there's MDC, MDC being mega damage, SDC being structural damage. Structural damage is more for characters and certain pieces of equipment. MDC is more for vehicles and mecha. And basically what it comes down to is weapons do one type of damage or another. Some have options to do both. But basically what it is it prevents you from taking an M16, shooting at a Veritech, and actually doing damage to it, because You just won't. So I appreciate how they did that, but then there's also a bunch of stuff in there with hit locations and things of that nature. There's even things in there about like, blowing out someone's radar or whatever. And it's extremely crunchy. It's not good, honestly, for fast paced mass combat. I think it's a fine system for like if you want to do like a one on one fight, like maybe a Zentradi commander versus your players. Uh, maybe something along those lines. So I had rules to do that. So I want to throw that out there is that the mecha combat system, which is going to be your primary form of combat in Robotech, it's just so crunchy, complex, and just bad. In all honesty, it could definitely have been better. Now, the next thing I want to cover about this book is background information, and well, I'll let you know if I ever find it because it's just not there. Um, Now, what I do want to say is this is a TTRPG that came out in the 80s. When this came out, Robotech was really new in the United States. It was still on television. You could find it on a regular basis of like marathons running and things of that nature. Um, I think that's actually why there's no background information. They expected you, they expected pretty much that anybody who bought this role playing system either watch the show, watch the movies, read the books, or read the comics. Because there was a lot of that stuff out there. A lot of that was around, and it was all really easy to access. Nowadays, the fact that there's no background information nowadays, uh, honestly, it just doesn't matter because there's the internet. You can actually go on YouTube and watch full episodes of Battletech. You can watch some of the movies. I believe Netflix is actually, they either are or were streaming the newest movie. So, in all honesty, the fact that there's no background information there didn't really hurt me personally and just doesn't really matter. Um, and honestly, I think this is something that honestly they did better than Strange Machine Games did once again because basically they were able to flesh out the rules a bit more and add different stuff to the game that basically they had room for in their 100 and some odd page book. And it also kept the book fairly thin. Understand at the time I was playing Dungeons and Dragons, so I was used to a thicker book. Let alone I was used to having 3 of them. So no background information. Honestly, for me, it's a bonus. For you, well, you be the judge. Another thing I do want to point out too, though, is some of the rules feels out of place. So, like some of the organization feels out of place. First off, like where the equipment's located, I definitely wouldn't have put the equipment where it's located. I actually would have put it a little deeper in the book than it is. There's other certain sections, such as skills and things of that nature, that feel a little out of place as well. And honestly, there's actually certain skills I would probably just cut from the game. Um, so there is some things that feels out of place. And another thing I do want to point out as a flaw is at times it can get a little jumbled. Honestly, once again, better than Strange Machine Games because there isn't a moment where I'm reading rules and I'm halfway through a paragraph and realize I'm reading a completely different rule. Uh, they do use font to their best of their ability. They do use bold lettering to the best of their ability. With that being, and spacing in most areas is pretty good in the book, but spacing could definitely have been better in my opinion. Also, what another thing I want to point out too is character creation takes an extremely long time. Um, Honestly, to me, it takes longer to make a character in Robotech, especially if you're a new player, than it does in Dungeons and Dragons. And now understand too, folks, I'm talking the original AD&D is what I'm comparing it to. Um, Now, with that being said, if you're familiar with Palladium games and you're familiar with how the system goes, how the rules are, and etc., it's still a long drawn out process, but it's not quite as bad because you kind of know what you're going for when you get into the game itself. And that kind of goes back to the whole thing about the Palladium role-playing games. They're all kind of one and the same, if you will, with just a different coat of paint. Uh, and then finally, the last thing I really want to point out here is just the art. The art, except for the cover, is all black and white. But honestly, I hate to do it once again, better than Strange Machine Games. Honestly, the black and white art in this book, the core rule book, understand, is better than most role-playing games. And like I said, it's all black and white. I mean, here's the Mac 2 monster. Here we have the Zentradi Commander Pod, I think is what this is called. I don't know. Battletech, they called it a Marauder. And then, of course, you have the Spartan here, which Battletech, they had called the, what they call this one, the Longbow. But I just feel the art is just really well done, and it captures Robotech really well. The artist who did the work in this book really cared about the artwork that he was putting in his book. And that is actually one thing I will give major credit to for any Palladium game, at least when it comes to the black and white art. Their color art can be a little hit and miss. We'll just put it that way. So, conclusion, what do I think about the old first edition Robotech? Honestly, if you want to play a Robotech TTRPG, this is the TTRPG you should be playing. I am not a fan of the Robotech TTRPG from Strange Machine Games. I've discussed that in my previous video. You can go check that review out. I've already done a review on that one. And there really isn't another Robotech TTRPG out there that I'm aware of. There might be some kind of generic homebrew system that someone has. But when it comes to official printed systems, this is the one you should be playing. You should be playing Robotech First Edition. Avoid Second Edition. Avoid Strange Machine Games version. Play this because it's actually really good. Of course, you're going to need to do some homebrew rules to make combat quicker. However, there's one huge flaw with the Palladium Robotech TTRPG, and that's that you just cannot get it. So realistically, the only way you're going to be able to get printed copies of this book is buying the books secondhand off websites like eBay. Or if you want PDF copies of it, you're not going to be able to get them through DriveThruRPG because unfortunate draconian licensing agreements. So if you want to get PDF copies, you're going to have to prepare yourself to sail the seven seas. I think it's worth it, though. That's just my opinion. Anyway, folks, hopefully you all enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for tuning in. And by the way, folks, I'm going to have a lot more Robotech content coming in the near future. So I would definitely, if you're interested in seeing it, is subscribe to this channel. There's also going to be, I'm going to be discussing the tragedy that is second edition Palladium Robotech. And I'm actually just going to be talking about other things in general when it comes to Robotech. But anyway, folks, hopefully you all enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for tuning in and have yourselves a wonderful day.